Welcome to the 2016 NENA Bylaws proposal review. This year we have something relatively unusual, and that should be unusual, an amendment in the nature of a substitute that essentially replaces an existing set of bylaws with a new set. My name is Trey Forgety. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at NENA, and I've been tapped to walk you through the bylaws proposal and take some questions and talk about how this got done, what is being proposed, and what the process will be going forward. And also, if you'd like, I'm happy to take questions and walk you through the text of the actual document. Before we get started formally, I'd like to remind you that you can always follow and like NENA. We're on Twitter at 911NENA911 and on Facebook at facebook.com/911NENA911. Now, to answer the perennial questions, yes, this webinar is being recorded. You can always watch online at www.youtube.com/911NENA911. And while we are online with the webinar, we invite you to make it interactive using the GoToWebinar interface to submit your questions, which we'll get to at the end of our presentation. You can go ahead and review our slides either in the handout section of the GoToWebinar interface or by looking online at https://www.nena.org/bylaws/slides, and you can see the proposed substitute bylaws at nena.org/resource/res-manager/membership/finalboardproposal.pdf as shown on the presented slide. So first of all, what is it that is being proposed? So at this year's annual membership meeting, the membership will consider an amendment in the nature of a substitute. This is basically a top-to-bottom overhaul that replaces the existing bylaws with a newly proposed set. It's a little bit different than the way this has been done at NENA in the past, because over time the existing bylaws had accumulated lots of very small grammatical changes, just things that needed to be updated, language that needed to be refreshed to reflect how things are actually done now, things as simple as saying CEO instead of executive director, things like that. And as a result of that, in going through the bylaws to fix all of that, it results in just a lot of little small changes that didn't need an entire amendment's worth of paperwork to go through one at a time. And so that's why you're seeing an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Now, to talk a little bit about why we're getting into this process, the updated bylaws that I'm going to walk you through in just a minute represent the first major overhaul of our existing bylaws in at least 7 years. I've been here for almost 6, and I understand that the last overhaul was at least a year and possibly 2 or 3 years before I joined the organization. So we had sort of come to the point where it was time to take a look at the bylaws and really just refresh them and make sure that they serve the current needs of the organization. We're also looking here to improve the organization and readability of the bylaws with better formatting, more consistent use of terms, highlighted terms that are defined, things like that. We also want to clarify ambiguous terms and procedures. Over time with organizations, it's common for things that everybody understands because they've been around for a long time to go essentially unstated. And so part of what we're trying to do here is make sure that all of the success NENA has built up over the past 30-odd years can be carried on into the future by making sure that all of those things are written down clearly in the bylaws. We also want to clearly specify roles and responsibilities because there are aspects of that have changed over time. There are things that previously were an officer's function that are now a board function, or previously a staff function that are now a board. Things get shuffled around over time, and those are the kinds of things that you want to make sure you're consistently capturing in the organizational document of an association like NENA. And so that was one of the other motivating factors. Now, to give you a little idea of where these changes are coming from, the Executive Board first flagged a number of issues with the existing bylaws back in 2014. And so beginning in early 2015, the staff worked in concert with the board to draft an initial proposed overhaul. And then the board really did spend a great amount of time, I would almost say an enormous amount of time, in fact, working through 2015, debating substantive changes and revising the proposal that we're about to talk about. They also worked in concert with the Bylaws Committee, and the Bylaws Committee, to their credit, worked through the bylaws in great detail and actually proposed revisions back to the board and said, you know, here are some things you want to think about before we push this out to the membership. The board approved those changes, and the version of the bylaws that you've received and that's available in your GoToWebinar interface was noticed out to the membership for consideration at our upcoming meeting in Indianapolis. We've just had a question here that I want to go ahead and take in line as to who was on the Bylaws Committee. That's an excellent question. This year, the Bylaws Committee was chaired by NENA past President Rick Galway. It also included Mary Boyd, Sharon Counterman, Bob Cobb, and I believe Ed Marecki. If I've left anyone out, I apologize, but I believe that was the composition of the Bylaws Committee this year. So let's move on and take a look at what's changing, and first talk a little bit about just sort of structurally what's changing. The remarkable thing is there's actually much less than you might think in an amendment in the nature of a substitute that is changing. About 85%, and I dare say it's probably even a little bit more than that, but about 85% of the text in the substitute bylaws is taken verbatim from the existing bylaws. And in fact, that number would be much higher other than just sort of changes in terminology and sentence structure and so forth. But the majority of this is not, in fact, new. A lot of it has just moved around. As I said before, one of the motivating factors here was making sure that the bylaws flowed logically from one issue to the next and set out sort of the owner's manual for the association in very clear terms. So many things have just been moved around so that they're all in consistent places. And one example we'll talk about is all of the powers and duties of the board are now in a single section. That was an important thing, so that, you know, when the board wanted to know what must we do, what can we do, they have one place to look. This is also the reason that we don't have a red line version of this. When we first sort of got into this, after we had put a lot of time and effort into this, someone said, well, why don't we look at the red line, see what's changed, and we did that, and the immediate comment back was, well, that's no good, because it's basically all red. I mean, everything has changed because there were so many things that were just moved around, and so basically that's why you're not seeing a red line version of this. We could give you one, but it really wouldn't be useful, because it would every single word, every single line would be tagged as an edit. So moving on into the specifics of what's changing, starting at the very top of the bylaws, that deals with very basic things like the name of the organization and the categories of membership and how one becomes a member. The new bylaws propose to specifically authorize group memberships. We've had those for a long time, but it's been sort of a kludgy sort of thing, because we have in our bylaws now only an individual membership option. So adding this makes it clear that even though membership itself still remains a personal, essentially property right, that the ability of the organization to sell memberships for group purposes is nonetheless clearly spelled out in the bylaws. We've also updated a number of provisions relating to how the membership communicates with the organization. We require the association to have a website to accept membership forms via the website, to publish them there, to publish member notices via email and on the website, to publish policies via the website. And then, and perhaps one of the biggest sort of long-standing, everybody thought it had already happened kind of change, we actually moved to now nomination and election processes that are electronic. So balloting in the future, there will be no longer an option for a mail ballot. In considering this change, the board has been very cautious over the years. The mail ballot requirement has now been there for a number of years, and I think at least in the last 5 years, I don't think we've had a single request for a mail ballot. So clearly electronic balloting has been very successful. We've also clarified Hall of Fame member eligibility for office. Hall of Fame has been for a long time called out as a separate category of membership, but there wasn't a specific provision relating to what their eligibility was when a Hall of Fame member wanted to run for office, and so the new bylaws actually clarified that they have the same eligibility that they would have if they hadn't received the Hall of Fame designation. So basically, if you would otherwise fall into a commercial category, you can run as if you were a commercial member, or excuse me, private sector member. If you fall into a public sector category, you can run as if you were that, telecommunicator, associate, etc. The proposed substitute also significantly updates the procedure for filling vacancies among the officers and directors. This is something that it doesn't come up often, but in the past 6 years it has come up twice. And when you have multiple vice presidents that succeed up toward the presidency, you have to sort of think through all the different permutations of, well, okay, how could a vacancy due to a disability, a death, a resignation, a removal, how could those things affect the succession of officers? And there was really a lot of time put into thinking about how this could be done in the bylaws in a way that didn't create confusion or contradictions when you actually got down and tried to execute the policy. And so that's among one of the major substantive changes that you'll see here, is there's a much more detailed procedure for how that should work. Moving on, the new proposal also spells out in more detail the roles and responsibilities of officers, directors, the CEO. One of the things that we noticed from sort of a legal standpoint in reviewing the existing bylaws is even though we've moved to a model at NENA where the organization has a chief executive officer, legally speaking, that's an officer of the corporation, our corporate bylaws, which are, after all, a legal filing we have to make every year with the state of Wisconsin where we're incorporated, they didn't mention the CEO as an officer of the corporation. And so from a standpoint of officer and director liability and the liability protections that they received, it was important to include that detail in there. Now, that doesn't change at all the sort of role and responsibility that the CEO has vis-a-vis the elected board members. In fact, all of that stays essentially the same. I think there's some wording changes in the details of the document, but that omission of the CEO is just removed. It's added back in the list of officers of the association. As I mentioned before, the powers and duties of the board are consolidated in a single section. That makes it a lot easier when the board wants to know what they should be doing at any given time, what they must be doing, and even what they can't do. That's an important thing across from the standpoint of having an owner's manual of the association, is knowing what to do, when, and how, and putting all of that into one place instead of having it scattered across half a dozen or more different parts of the bylaws should make it a much more user-friendly document. We've also changed, added, removed, etc., provisions that were applicable to the previous model where we had an executive board and executive director. That hasn't really been around for a long time. The new model with a board of directors and a CEO is now spelled out with more clarity around the roles and responsibilities and how all of that operates. Other things that are changing, the standing committees are updated in the proposal. One that's eliminated is the now defunct executive committee. This was a smaller, supposedly smaller committee that ended up being nearly half or more than half of the board anyway, and so the executive committee hasn't met in some time because the board determined it was better as a board of directors just to make decisions as a board of directors rather than having sort of an executive committee that really didn't have any power different from the board, didn't have any power at all, in fact. And so that has been eliminated. We've also added a couple of functions that are sort of core functions of a corporate board, but that weren't explicitly mentioned, even though they were getting done in the bylaws, to include investment and audit functions at the board level. Those are two very important board roles in terms of oversight of management, so those are called out specifically. And also a compensation and succession function that sort of makes sure that for tax purposes in particular, the board is very carefully and deliberately discharging its duty with respect to our status as a nonprofit, making sure that pay is taken care of in a way that doesn't, in the IRS lingo, inure to the benefit of any private person, but that nonetheless incents Brian, in this case, our CEO, to work in the best interest of the membership, and also deals with succession interests should someday Brian or any future CEO choose to leave the association. The other one that I'm particularly excited about personally, because I think this is a change that many organizations are making and that really makes business much sort of faster and easier to undertake, is that we're proposing to replace the complex 15th century Robert's Rules of Order with the modern Rules of Order. This is a book that, instead of being several hundred pages long, is several tens of pages long, and focuses much more on building consensus in board meetings, for example, rather than trying to wrangle hundreds of legislators. And I really think that's going to make a big difference just in the amount of time that is expended on substance versus procedure. So that's the end of the formal walkthrough, and I see we have a few questions here. And I'm going to take one first from Jerry Eisner. It's a great question. Can a 501c3 corporation lobby policymaking and legislative bodies? That appears to be an objective of the organization. And if I pull up a copy of the bylaws here, we can look at the objects of the association. I'm sure Jerry is referring here to Article 2B, that NENA will represent its members before communications regulatory agencies and appropriate policymaking and legislative bodies. The answer to your question, Jerry, is two-part. So in general, the answer is yes, a 501c3 can undertake policy, non-lobbying policy activities, so things like filing comments with the FCC, filing comments with the Department of Justice, and so forth, sort of policy-related proposals. They can do that basically without limitation. Where there is a limitation is when you get to actual out-and-out lobbying, in particular of a legislature, you don't have an ability to do more, to expend more than 10% of your time or money on lobbying processes. If you were to do that, you could potentially get into tax trouble, and that's fortunately something that we have not ever had to deal with appreciably at NENA, because we haven't had a lot of out-and-out lobbying efforts, certainly not to 10% of our time or 10% of our money. We could easily triple the amount, or quadruple even the amount of that we do without getting close to the line on that. So it is something that we certainly can do, but we're very conscious of the limitations about that and very careful to maintain our tax-exempt status by limiting the amount of that that we do. Another question also from Jerry gets to voting rights of a group. He says the voting section is silent on that. That's correct. As you'll see in the section on membership, even though memberships can be sold as a group, membership is still personal. As you can see, a public sector member is an individual. So while the organization can sell a group membership, it is still the individual member who's a part of that package that has the voting right. Essentially, membership in an association is like owning stock in a corporation. It's very personal. And you know, that's why we get into issues like transferability and so forth. You know, folks say, oh, well, I bought a group membership and somebody left. You know, I want to substitute somebody else in. Well, you can't really do that, because if you did, you'd be taking away property that belonged to one person and giving it to another. And so that's why memberships are non-transferable. which is one of the reasons. We also have another question here about Hall of Fame membership, and this is a good question. It goes to the structure of the bylaws about who designates a NENA member as eligible for Hall of Fame. That's actually a question that's set out in policy, and if I scroll down here really quickly, I can show you where that is called out in the section, and this goes back to consolidating as you can see here, it is the board that establishes criteria for designation as a Hall of Fame member and awards such designation based on a written policy. That was something that was very important to make sure that there was some flexibility in how that was carried out, but that nonetheless there was a very clear sort of mechanistic process for that. Anyone else have questions at this point? I was going to say if there are, if anyone wants to use the raise hand feature, I'm happy to take a question live on the air. We do have a number of other participants on the webinar. Okay, we haven't had other questions that we can take right now come in, but thank you all very much for being here and for raising your questions. I will continue to be available by phone at 202-618-4392 if you have questions that you'd like to have answered. I'm also available at tforgety, at nena.org. And I want to throw a special thank you out to all the members of the Bylaws Committee and the board who really spent a great deal of time on this tough and very detailed, substantive issue. Thank you to all of those folks. Really appreciate your work. With that, we will go ahead and end. Thank you all so much for being here, and please do take a look at the handouts and get in touch if there's more that you'd like to know. Bye-bye.